The satin hem of her wedding dress tore clean across a barbed wire fence. Nora didn't stop. She couldn't. Her hands were raw, shredded from branches and rock, and her lungs felt like they were on fire, seared by the thin Montana air. Her veil was long gone, probably snagged a mile back, a ghost of white lace left hanging in the wilderness. She didn't care about the veil. She didn't care about the dress. She was running from a sound, an echo that chased her harder than any wolf. "I'm sorry, Nora. I can't do this." Just 6 words. Clayton Pierce hadn't even had the decency to shout them. He hadn't looked her in the eye. He just leaned in, right there at the altar, with the preacher's Bible open and 200 pairs of eyes watching, and he whispered them. He whispered them like he was telling her the time. Then he turned, straightened his suit, and walked right out of the church. He left her standing there, a statue in white, holding a bouquet of dying flowers. Her mother's face had turned to granite. Her father looked like he was about to commit murder. And the guests, they started murmuring, a low hiss that filled the holy space like a nest of snakes. No one moved. No one came to her. Not her mother, not her father, not even her maid of honor who was also her sister. They just stared. So Nora had turned and run. She ran out the side door past the stained glass windows and just kept going. Now, 3 miles out of Hamilton, she finally collapsed. She sagged against a weathered fence post, the world a blur of tears and golden pasture. The sun was setting, painting the sky in angry strokes of orange and purple. The wind was picking up, a cold, sharp blade that cut right through the ruined silk of her dress. She was alone. Utterly and completely alone. The church bells had stopped ringing long ago, but she could still hear them in her head, mocking her. And that's when she heard a different sound. Hoofbeats, slow, heavy, and deliberate. This wasn't some kid out for a joyride. This was a man with a purpose. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to make herself smaller, to hide behind the fence post, but it was too late. A silhouette appeared on the ridge, a tall man on a tall horse, black against the dying sun. He rode closer, pulling the horse to a stop a few yards away. He just sat there for a long moment, looking at her, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet assessment, like he'd found a wounded coyote on his land. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like gravel rolling downhill. "You all right, miss?" Nora couldn't speak. She just looked up, her vision blurry with dust and grief. The man swung himself off the horse in one smooth, practiced motion. His boots crunched on the dry earth as he walked toward her, but he stopped a respectful distance away. He didn't crowd her. He didn't reach for her. He just stood there, a solid presence in a world that had just dissolved into chaos. "You don't look all right," he added, and there wasn't an ounce of judgment in his voice. She wanted to lie, to say she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. A sob caught in her throat, sharp as a thorn. She just shook her head. "I'm not hurt," she finally whispered, her voice raspy. "Just left." The man nodded once, a short, sharp movement, as if that single word explained everything. "Wyatt Callahan," he said, tipping the brim of his hat just slightly. "This is my land. You're welcome to it. But the night gets cold fast up here." The name Callahan echoed in her foggy brain. Even in her daze, she knew that name. Everyone in Hamilton knew it. The Callahans owned the biggest cattle spread in the whole Bitterroot Valley. This man, Wyatt, was a local legend of sorts. A man born to wealth who worked harder than any of his hired hands. A man who kept to himself. A recluse since his own engagement had imploded years ago. Town gossip was a cruel sport, and Wyatt Callahan had been its star player for a long time. He held out a canteen. She hesitated for a second, then took it, her bloody hands shaking. The water was lukewarm and tasted of metal, but it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. It felt like it was putting out the fire in her lungs. When she handed it back, his eyes lingered on her ruined dress. "That dress," he said, his voice flat, "wasn't made for running through the mountains." A raw, broken laugh escaped her lips. "It wasn't made to be left at the altar, either." He didn't smile, but a hint of something softened in his eyes. "You came a long way to get lost." "I didn't come to get lost," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I came to disappear." Wyatt shifted his weight. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick, folded flannel shirt. He tossed it to her. She caught it out of instinct. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke and leather. "Put that on," he said. "The wind up here has teeth." She draped the shirt over her shoulders. It was still warm from his body, and for the first time since Clayton had whispered those 6 words, she didn't feel the crushing weight of being completely alone. "Do you need to go back?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Back to what?" The question ripped out of her, ragged and torn. "Back to the whispers, to the pitying looks, back to a town where everyone knows I was left at the altar like a fool?" Wyatt didn't offer any empty platitudes. He just crouched down, not too close, but near enough that she could see the hard lines etched around his eyes and the flecks of gray in his dark hair. This was not a man who was easily shaken. He looked like he'd been carved out of the same rock as the mountains around them. He looked like he was built for storms. "How close were you?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "When she left you." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His gaze drifted out over the vast expanse of his land. 3 weeks to the day? Nora nodded. They didn't need to say her name. Constance, the governor's daughter, a ghost that still haunted the whispers in Hamilton. "Did you ever think about trying again?" Nora asked, the question surprising her as much as it probably surprised him. "I thought about it," he admitted, his voice low. "But I don't believe in it, not the way they sell it in churches." She turned to look at him, really look at him. "What do you believe in then?" His eyes met hers, and they were as clear and unforgiving as the Montana sky. "I believe in hard work. I believe in a quiet evening. I believe in keeping your word, and I believe in contracts, the kind that don't pretend to be about love." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the wind sighing through the tall grass. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. "Are you offering me something, Mr. Callahan?" she finally asked. Wyatt stood up, dusting off his leather gloves. "I'm offering a roof, a name. No questions asked, no strings attached." Nora stared at him, her mind racing. Was he insane? Was she? "You want to marry me?" "I want to give you a choice," he said, and the simplicity of it struck her like a physical blow. A choice. It was the one thing she hadn't had all day. It was the one thing she hadn't had her entire life, a life that had been perfectly planned out for her by her parents, by Clayton, by society. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet. Her whole body ached. She pulled his flannel shirt tighter around her, a shield against the cold and the shame. She looked into Wyatt Callahan's steady, unreadable eyes and felt something shift deep inside her. It wasn't love. It wasn't even hope. It was recognition. 2 broken people standing at the edge of the world, 2 empty houses, and maybe, just maybe, one impossible solution. "All right, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice clear and firm for the first time all day. "I'll marry you." He just nodded once, as if he'd expected it all along. "Then let's ride, before the cold really sets in." He helped her onto his tall black stallion, and as they turned away from the setting sun, Nora didn't look back. She didn't look at the torn piece of her dress still caught on the fence. She didn't look down the trail that led back to her old life. She had no idea what she was riding toward. But for the first time in her life, she had chosen it. and she had a strange feeling that the man whose back she was clinging to knew exactly what he was doing. She just couldn't figure out why. The Callahan ranch house wasn't a mansion. It was better. It was a fortress. Built from thick, dark timber and native stone, it stood on a low rise overlooking a valley that seemed to stretch on forever. As they rode up in the deep blue of twilight, a single warm light glowed from a window. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, a silent welcome against the star-dusted sky. The place smelled of pine and cold earth and a deep, ingrained solitude. Nora slid off the horse, her legs so weak they nearly buckled. The adrenaline that had kept her running for miles had finally drained away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Wyatt dismounted and tied the reins to a post with quiet efficiency. He didn't offer a hand, didn't say a word of comfort. He just walked up the porch steps, turned the heavy knob, and held the door open for her. The inside was exactly like the man who owned it, clean, sparse, and functional. A heavy wooden table stood in the center of the main room, flanked by 4 simple chairs. A fire was already crackling in the massive stone hearth, its flames dancing against the walls. Iron pots hung from hooks in the kitchen area, and a narrow hallway disappeared into the shadows at the back of the house. There were no photographs on the mantel, no lace on the windows, no clutter of a life shared. It was the home of a man who lived alone and was used to it. Nora stepped over the threshold, still clutching his flannel shirt around her like armor. "Guest room's on the left," Wyatt said, his back already to her as he walked toward the fire. "Bed's made. There are fresh linens in the chest. I'll find you something to change into." He vanished down the dark hallway without another word. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, feeling like a ghost. She was a splash of chaotic, messy emotion in this man's rigidly ordered world. She didn't belong here. But then, where did she belong? When Wyatt returned, he was carrying another folded shirt and a pair of canvas trousers that looked like they could fit 2 of her. "It's the best I can do for now," he said, his voice neutral. He placed them on the table without looking at her. In the guest room, she peeled off the tattered remains of her wedding gown. It felt like shedding a skin. She folded the ruined silk into a small, tight square, as if she could physically compress the humiliation it represented. She washed her face and her bleeding hands in the basin of icy water, scrubbing until the stinging pain brought her back to reality. The clothes he'd given her were huge, but they were warm and clean. They smelled of cedar and hay, a scent that was honest and real. When she emerged, Wyatt was stirring a large pot hanging over the fire. "Stew," he said, not turning around. "Elk. Nothing fancy." "I'm not hungry," she replied, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. "You haven't eaten since this morning," he stated, a simple fact. "Sit." His tone wasn't unkind, but it left no room for argument. So she sat. They ate in a thick, heavy silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Nora found herself watching him from under her lashes. He ate slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on the flames. He was a man who wasted nothing, not food, not words, not movements. Finally, she couldn't take the silence anymore. She set her spoon down. "You said no questions," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But I have to ask one." He looked up then, his gaze direct and piercing. It was the first time he'd really looked at her since they'd arrived. "Why me?" she asked. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his powerful arms over his chest. "You weren't the only one left standing at an altar." "I figured that much," she said, pushing. "But that doesn't answer my question. Why offer marriage? A man like you could have just offered me a meal and sent me on my way." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if he were trying to read a map in a foreign language. "Because," he said finally, his voice low and serious, I don't believe in halfway measures. When a woman in a wedding dress shows up on my property bleeding and broken, she doesn't need charity. She needs a new beginning. And in this valley, people don't give a woman a clean start unless she's wearing a man's ring. Nora swallowed hard. He was right. Her own mother had preached that gospel her entire life. An unmarried woman was a problem. A widow was a tragedy. But a wife was a respectable part of the community. But why take on that problem? She pressed, needing to understand. Why make me your problem? His jaw worked for a moment before he answered. Because I know what it feels like to be humiliated by people you trusted. Because this house is too quiet. And because I own more land than one man can ever work. But mostly, he paused, his eyes finding hers in the firelight. Because I don't have anyone to ask me if I've eaten. The words weren't romantic. They were raw, stripped-down truth. And somehow that honesty hit her harder than any flowery poem ever could. It was a contract, just like he'd said, a partnership of broken pieces. What if people talk? She whispered. They're already talking, he said without missing a beat. A tiny, involuntary smile touched her lips. Do you always have an answer for everything? Only for the things that matter. A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. You can sleep in tomorrow, he said, standing up and collecting their empty bowls. I'm mending the north fence at sunup. Coffee will be on the stove. He rinsed the bowls in a basin, his movements economical and sure. He was about to head down the hall to his own room when he stopped at the threshold. He didn't turn around, but his voice was clear. I'm not asking you to love me, Nora. I'm not even asking you to stay. I'm just asking you to make it through tonight. She nodded, though he couldn't see her. When the door to her room closed, the silence of the house felt different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. She crawled into the simple bed, the sheets crisp and cold, and pulled the heavy wool blanket up to her chin. For the first time all day, she didn't cry. There were no tears left. As she drifted off to sleep, she realized this place wasn't a home. Not yet. But it wasn't the end of the world either. It was a beginning. A strange, terrifying, and possibly dangerous beginning. She woke to the smell of coffee so strong it could raise the dead and the distant rhythmic clang of a hammer against metal. The sun was just beginning to spill over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, sending long, golden fingers through the frosted glass of her window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the past 24 hours came rushing back, a tidal wave of shame and confusion. But there was no panic. The frantic, pounding heartbeat that had been her constant companion was gone. In its place was a strange, hollow quiet. She got out of bed and padded to the small basin. The water was shockingly cold, but it felt good. It felt real. She looked at her reflection in the small, warped mirror above it. Her eyes were puffy, and a faint bruise was starting to form on her shoulder where Clayton had grabbed her arm just before he'd walked away. But she looked different. The fear was gone, replaced by a hard, watchful stillness. She pulled on the clothes Wyatt had given her and stepped out into the main room. The fire had been stoked, and a mug of steaming black coffee sat waiting for her on the table. Next to it was a piece of paper with a few words scrawled in a bold, angular script. Fencing North Line. Back before noon. Feed for the horses is in the barrel. Stay warm. The simple, practical kindness of the note caught her off guard. There was no pity in it, no expectation. He was treating her not as a refugee, but as a part of the ranch's ecosystem. She drank the coffee, letting its bitter warmth spread through her, and then she started to move. She washed the few dishes, tidied the already tidy room, and then she let her curiosity take over. The house was a testament to its owner. Everything had a purpose. There were books on animal husbandry and crop rotation stacked next to a worn Bible. There were maps of the valley tacked to one wall marked with faded pencil lines. And then she saw it. Tucked away in a corner, almost hidden beside the massive stone fireplace, was a single small photograph pinned to the wooden wall. It was a younger Wyatt. The lines around his eyes were softer, the shadows not so deep. He was standing next to a beautiful woman with dark, soulful eyes and a proud set to her chin. They were both smiling, and both of them were wearing simple gold wedding bands. The edges of the photograph were curled and faded, but it had been treated with care. Nora felt a jolt. Wife? He had said he'd been left. He hadn't said he'd been married. Where was this woman now? What had happened in this quiet, lonely house? Before she could spiral into speculation, she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Peeking through the window, she saw a small, sturdy woman with a brightly colored scarf wrapped around her head driving a buckboard, a young boy bouncing on the seat beside her. Nora's first instinct was to hide, but she was done hiding. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. The woman pulled the wagon to a halt and broke into a wide, friendly grin. Well, I'll be. I guess the rumors are true after all. Wyatt Callahan finally went and got himself a bride. Nora blinked, speechless. I'm Louisa Romero, the woman said, hopping down with surprising agility. We live on the next ridge over. This here is my son, Mateo. The boy gave a shy wave. I brought you some eggs and a few apples. Figured you could use them. Louisa's dark eyes were sharp and intelligent, and they took in Nora's borrowed clothes and bruised shoulder in a single glance. Heard what happened in town? She said, her voice softening. Folks around here have long memories for a scandal. But Wyatt, he's good people. And you, she tilted her head, you look like you've been through a lot worse than a few gossiping hens. Thank you, Nora managed to say. I didn't expect any visitors. If you're planning on staying, Louisa said, handing her the basket of eggs, you'll need to know who your friends are. And Wyatt trusts us. How long have you known him? Nora asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Since before his daddy passed, Louisa said. He was a different man back then, still quiet, but he used to smile more. Before... Her voice trailed off. Before Constance? Nora finished for her. Louisa's eyebrows shot up. So he told you about her? He told me he was left, Nora said carefully. He didn't mention she was the governor's daughter. Louisa let out a short, sharp laugh. Oh, honey, he wasn't just left. That woman didn't just walk out of a church. She ran off with a state senator from Helena 2 days before the wedding. Sent a telegram. A telegram! Left Wyatt standing there with a house full of her rich relatives and a whole town ready to laugh at him. He didn't speak a word to anyone for months after that. Just worked this land like he was trying to kill it or maybe kill the part of himself that hurt. Nora felt a knot tighten in her stomach. His story was so much worse than she had imagined. It was her story, amplified and twisted. He's kept to himself ever since, Louisa continued, her voice softer now, until you showed up. I'm not some project for him to fix, Nora said quickly. Louisa smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Don't you worry about that. Wyatt Callahan doesn't fix things. He builds them to last. If you stay, just make sure you're staying for the man he is, not for the fortress he's built around himself. After Louisa left, Nora sat on the porch steps, the basket of apples beside her. She looked out at the vast, empty land and tried to piece together the puzzle of the man who had taken her in. When Wyatt rode in around noon, covered in dust and smelling of pine, he looked tired but steady. Had a visitor, she said as he dismounted. He raised an eyebrow. Louisa. It wasn't a question. She told me about Constance, Nora said, watching his face for a reaction. He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable. "Is that your way of saying you're ready to leave?" "No," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "It's my way of saying I think I understand." They stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with unspoken things. They weren't husband and wife. They weren't even friends. They were two survivors, circling each other, trying to decide if they could trust the reflection they saw in the other's eyes. Finally, Wyatt cleared his throat. "I've got more fencing to do, but tomorrow we ride into town. There's a council meeting." "A council meeting?" "They want to survey this land," he said, his voice turning hard as iron. "For a new railway spur. They've been trying to buy me out for years." Nora frowned. "And you won't sell." "Never," he said flatly. "This land is all I have left." He paused, and his eyes bored into hers. "The man pushing the hardest on the council is Charles Pierce, Clayton's father." The air went still. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The timing, the proposal. It wasn't just about two broken people finding solace. It was about something else entirely. She had run from one trap, only to walk right into the middle of a war. "So this wasn't random," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You finding me on your land." Wyatt didn't flinch. "Nothing in this valley is ever random, Nora." He turned to unsaddle his horse. "The Pierces want this land. They tried to get it by marrying you to their son, linking your family's influence to theirs. When that failed, they came back to their original plan, taking it from me." Nora crossed her arms, a cold fury beginning to burn through her grief. She wasn't a refugee. She was a pawn. "Well," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, "if Charles Pierce thinks he's going to take this place, he's in for a surprise. He won't be dealing with a girl in a wedding dress this time." Wyatt turned back to her, a long, slow look passing over her face. A flicker of something that looked like respect, maybe even admiration, lit his dark eyes. "Good," was all he said, but in that single word, the dynamic between them shifted. She was no longer just a guest. She was an ally, and their war had just begun. The next morning, the wind had a bite to it, a restless energy that seemed to mirror the tension coiling in Nora's stomach. She tied her hair back with a piece of twine and met Wyatt by the stables as the sun was painting the eastern sky a pale, fragile pink. He was already saddling two horses, his movements economical and precise. "We ride in quiet," he said without looking up from tightening a cinch. "Town council meetings are a performance. They don't like surprises unless they're the ones orchestrating them." "And what am I?" Nora asked, pulling on a pair of worn leather gloves he'd left for her. "A surprise or part of the performance?" He finally looked at her, his eyes serious. "You're my wife," he said, the word hanging in the cold air between them. "In this town, that's all the reason they need, and all the reason you need." Wife. The word felt like a costume she was wearing, a role she was playing. She wasn't sure if it was a lie or a truth she hadn't grown into yet. The ride into Hamilton was silent. The town looked the same as it had 2 days ago, but to Nora, it felt like a lifetime had passed. The storefronts seemed to leer at her. The muddy streets seemed to want to suck her down. As they dismounted in front of the town hall, she could feel the eyes on them. Whispers followed them like a trail of smoke as they walked up the steps, Wyatt's hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a gesture of solidarity, a silent declaration. The council chamber was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke, old paper, and unearned authority. 5 men sat behind a heavy oak table, their faces grim. At the head of the table sat Charles Pierce, Clayton's father. He had the same arrogant set to his jaw as his son, but his eyes were colder, harder, a predator's eyes. He looked up when they entered, and a slow, smug smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Pierce said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Wyatt Callahan, And you've brought the little runaway with you. How theatrical. Wyatt didn't rise to the bait. He simply removed his hat and stood before the council, a silent, immovable object. "Pierce," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I heard you were planning on trespassing on my land. I figured I'd save you the trip." Pierce chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "The council is simply exploring options for the new railway spur, Callahan. It's for the good of the whole community, a necessary expansion. Eminent domain is a perfectly legal tool." "My land is not an option," Wyatt said, his voice dangerously calm. "And your price doesn't matter. It's not for sale." Another councilman, a man with a perpetually worried expression, leaned forward. "But Wyatt, think of the jobs it would create, the growth." "I am thinking about growth," Wyatt shot back. "And I think this has less to do with jobs and more to do with the fact that my land has the only reliable water source in the South Valley. A water source you've been trying to get your hands on for a decade, Pierce." The room went quiet. All eyes shifted from Wyatt to Charles Pierce, whose smug smile had vanished. "Are you accusing this council of having ulterior motives?" Pierce snarled. "I'm not accusing," Wyatt said. "I'm stating a fact. Your son tries to strong-arm his way into a marriage to consolidate power and fails. Suddenly, a long-dead railway proposal is resurrected, and the proposed route just happens to cut right through my property and divert my water. That's not progress. That's a shakedown." The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then Nora stepped forward. All eyes snapped to her. "If I may," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. "I realize I'm not a landowner here." "Then you're not relevant to this discussion, Mrs. Callahan," Pierce snapped, using the name like a weapon. "She's relevant to me." Wyatt's voice cut through the air, low and sharp as a razor. "And she's relevant to the fact that your son left her at the altar not out of a change of heart, but because she discovered your little scheme." A gasp went through the small crowd of townspeople who had gathered at the back of the room. Charles Pierce's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "I didn't come here to air my personal grievances," Nora continued, her gaze locked on Pierce. "But I will say this. A family that builds its future on lies, coercion, and public humiliation shouldn't be trusted to build a railroad, let alone a community." "You're just a bitter, jilted woman," Pierce spat. "And you're just a thief in a suit," Nora retorted, without missing a beat. A shocked silence fell over the room. Then someone at the back of the room started to clap. Just one person, then another. Charles Pierce slammed his hand on the table, his face a mask of fury. "This meeting is over," he roared. Wyatt put his hat back on. "Put it in the record," he said, his voice ringing with finality. "I will not sell. I will not cede 1 inch of Callahan land. If you send surveyors, they'd better come with the sheriff and a court order, because they will be treated as trespassers." He turned, put his hand back on Nora's back, and guided her out of the chamber. As they walked down the steps and back into the cold daylight, she felt like she could finally breathe again. "Well," she said, letting out a shaky laugh, "that was eventful." Wyatt didn't smile, but the hard line of his jaw seemed to relax slightly. "You held your own." "I'm learning," she said quietly. They were about to mount their horses when a voice called out, dripping with scorn. "Enjoying the show? The runaway bride and the hermit playing heroes." Clayton was leaning against the saloon entrance, a lazy smirk on his handsome face. He looked completely unbothered by the chaos his family had created. "You're a coward, Clayton," Nora said, her voice flat and devoid of the pain he so clearly wanted to see. He just chuckled. "And you're naive. This little charade won't last. My father always gets what he wants. Always." Wyatt turned his horse to face him, his expression unreadable. "Your father isn't the one you should be worried about." Clayton's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Oh, right. The big, tough rancher. What are you going to do? I'm going to make sure that for the first time in your pampered life, Wyatt said, his voice so low and cold it could freeze water, you face the consequences of your actions. Clayton paled slightly but covered it with a sneer. Enjoy your ranch while it lasts, Callahan. They rode out of town without looking back. Once they were on the open trail, the silence stretched for miles. He's not going to stop, Nora said finally. No, Wyatt agreed, but neither are we. When they got back to the ranch, the first snowflakes of the season were beginning to fall, soft and silent. Nora stood on the porch, watching them drift down, a strange sense of purpose settling over her. She went inside, built up the fire, and pulled out one of the old maps from the wall. She found a pen and a piece of paper and began to write down names. The Romeros, the old baker in town who hated the Pierces, the retired sheriff who lived up in the hills. Wyatt came in, shaking the snow from his hat, and stopped when he saw what she was doing. "What's that?" he asked. "A battle plan," she said, not looking up. "They want a war? We'll give them one. But we're not going to fight it their way. We're going to fight it ours." Wyatt came and stood beside her, looking down at the list of names. For a long moment he was silent. Then he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite place, "You belong here, Nora. More than you know." She looked up at him then, the firelight dancing in her determined eyes. "I don't want to just belong, Wyatt," she said. "I want to win." And in his eyes she saw the same fierce, unyielding resolution. The line between them, the one that separated convenience from conviction, began to blur. They were no longer two broken people. They were a single, unshakable force, and the storm was just getting started. The next few days passed in a strange, charged quiet. On the surface, life at the Callahan Ranch fell into a rhythm. Wyatt rode the fence lines, his rifle always in its scabbard, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Nora took over the house, but she did more than that. She turned the kitchen table into a war room. The map of the valley was always spread out, now dotted with pins marking allies, enemies, and disputed territories. Every evening they would sit by the fire, not in silence, but in strategy. He would tell her about the land, about the families who had been pushed out by the Pierces over the years, about old feuds and forgotten alliances. She, in turn, showed him a different kind of strength. She wrote letters. Not angry, accusatory letters, but calm, factual, and persuasive ones. She sent them by courier to every small rancher and business owner in the valley who had ever been wronged by Charles Pierce. She wasn't just asking for help, she was building a coalition. One afternoon, as a cold sleet ticked against the window panes, a sharp knock came at the door. Wyatt opened it to find a young boy, maybe 12 years old, shivering on the porch. The boy looked terrified. He thrust a crumpled, folded piece of paper into Wyatt's hand, then turned and ran, disappearing into the gray mist without a single word. Wyatt unfolded the note. The writing was hasty, almost illegible. "They're coming. After dark, West Gate. It's a trap." There was no signature. He handed the note to Nora. Her face hardened as she read it. "They're trying to provoke you," she said. "They want you to react, to do something they can use against you." "I know," Wyatt said, his voice a low growl. "They want me to look like the aggressor. The unstable hermit everyone in town already thinks I am. So what do we do?" Wyatt's eyes gleamed with a cold fire. "We don't fall for the trap. We spring it." They didn't ride out with guns blazing. Instead, they rode to the west gate just before dusk and found a position high up on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire pasture. They lay flat on the cold stone, hidden by the shadows, and they waited. The sleet turned to a fine, wet snow. The world went silent. Hours passed. Nora's fingers were numb, but she didn't complain. She lay beside Wyatt, watching the darkness, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing beside her. Then, they heard it. The low rumble of a wagon, its wheels muffled by the snow. 3 men emerged from the darkness. They weren't surveyors. They were carrying crowbars and lanterns. Wyatt recognized one of them as a hired hand who had been fired from 3 different ranches for starting fights. They weren't there to measure land. They were there to tear down his fence. "They're hoping I'll ride down there and start shooting," Wyatt whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Then they can claim self-defense." "But we're not down there," Nora whispered back. The men got to work, their movements clumsy and loud in the silent night. They pried a post from the ground, then another. They were laughing, making a show of it. And that's when Wyatt raised a rifle to his shoulder. He wasn't aiming at the men. He was aiming at the lantern one of them had placed on a fence post. He fired. The shot echoed across the valley like a clap of thunder. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and flame. The 3 men froze, their faces white with shock in the sudden darkness. "You're trespassing on Callahan land!" Wyatt's voice boomed from the ridge, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "The sheriff has been notified. If you're not gone in 30 seconds, you'll be charged with property damage and attempted intimidation." The men didn't wait for the 30 seconds. They scrambled back to their wagon and disappeared into the night as fast as they had come. Wyatt and Nora waited until the sound of their wagon faded completely before they moved. As they rode back to the house, the snow falling thick and heavy around them, Nora felt a thrill of victory. "Do you think they'll be back?" she asked. "They will," Wyatt said, "but not like that. They know we're not stupid. Now the real fight begins." The next morning, Wyatt rode into town alone. He didn't go to the council. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Emery McCall was a man who looked like he'd been carved from a block of oak, solid, weathered, and not easily moved. Wyatt tossed the broken pieces of the lantern onto his desk. "3 of Pierce's men were on my land last night, McCall. They were tearing down my fence." The sheriff sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You got proof it was Pierce's men?" "I've got a witness," Wyatt said. "My wife." McCall's eyebrows went up. "Wife, huh? Things change fast in this valley." He poked at the broken glass. "You know how powerful Charles Pierce is, Wyatt. He's got friends in Helena. Big friends." "I'm not asking you to fight my battles, Emery," Wyatt said, his voice level. "I'm asking you to do your job. Enforce the law for everyone, not just the rich." The sheriff looked at Wyatt for a long time, then gave a slow nod. "I'll make a report, and maybe I'll pay Mr. Pierce a little visit. Remind him where property lines are drawn." As Wyatt was leaving the sheriff's office, he saw a wagon pull up. It was Louisa Romero. She rushed over to him, her face etched with worry. "Wyatt, I heard what happened last night. Are you and Nora all right?" "We're fine, Louisa," he said, his eyes watchful. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, pressing a warm loaf of bread into his hands. "You have to be careful. Pierce is getting desperate. He'll stop at nothing." "I know," Wyatt said. "Thanks for the warning." He watched her go, a strange, uneasy feeling settling in his gut. The anonymous note had saved them from a trap, but something about Louisa's frantic concern felt off. It felt rehearsed. He rode back to the ranch, his mind racing. Nora met him on the porch, her face pale. "Another note came," she said, holding out a piece of paper. "It was left on the door." Wyatt took it. This time the message was just 2 words. "Don't trust her." He looked at Nora, then back at the note. Her. Who was her? Was it a warning about Louisa? Or was it something else? He looked out at the vast, snow-covered landscape. They had allies. They had a plan. But they were surrounded by shadows, and he was beginning to realize that the most dangerous enemy might not be the one you can see, but the one who's pretending to be your friend. The war for the valley wasn't just about land anymore. It was about truth, and the truth was a far more treacherous territory. A heavy silence settled in the ranch house that evening. The second note lay on the table between them, a two-word mystery that cast a long shadow over their fragile alliance. Don't trust her. It could mean anyone. It could mean nothing. But in the high-stakes game they were playing, they couldn't afford to dismiss it. "Louisa," Nora said, voicing the thought that was hanging in the air. "She was here this morning, right after you left for town. She was overly concerned, asking a lot of questions about our plans, about who was on our side." Wyatt nodded slowly, his face grim. "She met me in town, too. Said she came as soon as she heard about last night. But how could she have heard so fast? The sound of one gunshot wouldn't carry all the way to her ridge." The pieces started to click into place, forming a picture that made Nora's blood run cold. Louisa, the friendly neighbor. The first person to offer a kind word. The one who had filled in the details of Wyatt's past, making him seem more sympathetic, more trustworthy. "She wasn't trying to help me understand you," Nora whispered, the realization dawning on her. "She was trying to earn my trust, so I would talk." Wyatt's fist clenched on the table. He had trusted the Romeros his whole life. Her betrayal, if it was true, cut deeper than any fence line. "She's been feeding Pierce information all along." "The first note," Nora said, her mind racing. "The one that warned us about the trap at the West Gate. What if that wasn't from a friend? What if it was from Louisa, setting us up?" "No," Wyatt said, shaking his head. "That doesn't make sense. The warning was real. It saved us." He stood up and began to pace in front of the fireplace, the restlessness coming off him in waves. "Someone in this valley is playing a different game. Someone is trying to help us, but they're too afraid to show their face." The paranoia was a poison, seeping into the cracks of their fortress. They couldn't trust their neighbors. They couldn't trust anonymous notes. All they could trust was each other. "We need to change the plan," Nora said, her voice firm. She stood up and rolled up the map on the table. "We can't fight this war from here. We're isolated. We need to unite everyone. Get them all in one place. We need to show Pierce that he's not fighting one man. He's fighting the whole valley." Wyatt stopped pacing and looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. She wasn't just a pawn or an ally anymore. She was a general. "The old Grange Hall," he said. "It's neutral ground. We could call a town meeting." "Not a town meeting," Nora corrected. "A council of war." The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. Nora wrote a simple, powerful summons, and Wyatt rode for 2 days straight, delivering it personally to every family on their list, from the farthest corners of the valley. He didn't just hand them a piece of paper. He looked each man and woman in the eye and told them what was at stake. He spoke of the land, of their history, of the future they were about to lose. On the night of the meeting, the old Grange Hall was filled to capacity. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, coffee, and nervous anticipation. These were proud, independent people. They weren't used to asking for help, and they weren't used to uniting. Nora stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding, while Wyatt stood by the door, a silent, watchful guardian. She began to speak. She didn't shout. She didn't make grand promises. She just told them the truth. She told them about the Pierce's plan, about the lies, about the intimidation. She laid out the evidence they had gathered, piece by piece. "Charles Pierce wants you to believe that this is just a dispute between him and Wyatt Callahan," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But it's not. Last week it was Wyatt's fence. Last month it was the McBride's water rights. Next month it could be your land, your home. He's picking us off one by one because he knows that alone we are all vulnerable. But together—" She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room, meeting the gaze of every person there. "Together, we are a force that he cannot break." A murmur went through the crowd. She could see the doubt on some faces, the fear, but she could also see a flicker of hope. Then, an old rancher from the back of the room stood up. "It's easy to talk tough, miss. But Pierce has money. He has lawyers. What do we have?" Before Nora could answer, Wyatt's voice cut through the room, deep and steady. "You have this," he said, and he held up a thick, leather-bound ledger. "My father's ledger. In it, he documented every handshake deal, every water agreement, every property line in this valley going back 50 years. These aren't court documents. They're a man's word. And in this valley, a man's word used to mean something." He opened the ledger. "It says here that your family, Mr. Davison, has the right to graze on the North Ridge until the first snow. A right Pierce tried to deny you last year. It says here, Mrs. Gable, that the spring on your land is yours, and yours alone. A spring Pierce is trying to claim for his railroad." He went on, name after name, right after right. He was giving them back their history, their legacy. He was reminding them of the community they had once been, before fear had divided them. When he was done, the room was silent. Then the old rancher, Davison, stood up again. "My father told me about that ledger," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was lost." He looked at Wyatt, then at Nora. "Sign me up. Pierce has bullied my family for the last time." It was like a dam breaking. One by one, people stood up, their voices joining a chorus of defiance. "I'll sign. Count me in. What do we need to do?" By the end of the night, they had a signed petition with over 50 names. They had a war chest with contributions from nearly every family in the room. And they had a plan. They were going to take the fight to Helena. They were going to bypass the corrupt town council and go straight to the State Land Commission. As they rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, a sense of triumphant exhaustion settled over Nora. They had done it. They had turned the tide. But as they approached the ranch, they saw it. A single, flickering light in the distance, not the warm, steady glow of the lamp in their window, but a frantic, angry orange light dancing against the night sky. "No," Wyatt whispered, his voice choked. He spurred his horse into a gallop, Nora right behind him. It was the barn. Flames were pouring from the roof, licking at the dark sky. The smell of smoke and burning hay filled the air. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a declaration of total war. They had shown their strength, and Pierce had responded with fire. As Nora watched the building that had become a symbol of their defiance burn to the ground, she knew that this was no longer a fight for land. It was a fight for survival. The heat was a physical blow. Wyatt was off his horse before it even came to a stop, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. "The horses!" he yelled, running toward the inferno. Nora's mind went numb with horror. Inside that burning barn were not just tools and hay, but Wyatt's 2 best mares and a newborn foal. She watched, paralyzed, as he ripped his flannel shirt off, soaked it in the water trough, and wrapped it around his face before plunging into the roaring doorway without a second's hesitation. The sound from inside was terrifying. The panicked, high-pitched screaming of trapped animals mixed with the roar of the fire and the splintering crash of collapsing timbers. To Nora, standing helpless in the snow, it felt like an eternity. She screamed his name until her throat was raw. Then, an impossible shape emerged from the smoke. It was Wyatt, half carrying, half shoving one of the mares, its eyes wide with terror. He slapped it on the rump, and it bolted into the night. He didn't even pause. He turned and ran straight back into the fire. Seconds later, he reappeared with the second mare, its coat singed and smoking. He sent it running after the first, and then, to Nora's utter disbelief, he turned to go back in a third time. "Wyatt, no!" she shrieked, starting to run toward him. "It's too late! The roof is going!" He didn't listen. He disappeared back into the blazing maw of the barn. Nora could hear the groan of the main support beam giving way. She was sure he was dead. She squeezed her eyes shut, a sob tearing through her. And then he was there. He stumbled out of the doorway, coughing and covered in soot, the tiny, trembling foal cradled in his arms. Just as he cleared the entrance, the entire roof collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a fountain of sparks and embers high into the sky. He fell to his knees in the snow, still holding the foal, gasping for air. Nora ran to him, her own lungs aching in sympathy. She helped him lay the foal gently on the ground, and then reached for him, her hands hovering over the angry red burns that were already starting to appear on his arms and back. He wasn't a hermit. He wasn't a recluse. He was a hero. In that moment, watching him risk his life not for land, not for revenge, but for a helpless animal, everything shifted for Nora. The contract, the convenience, the alliance, it all burned away in the heat of the fire, leaving something raw and real and undeniable in its place. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had just happened. By the time the fire finally burned itself out, leaving behind a smoldering black skeleton against the dawn sky, a hard, cold resolve had settled over them both. They didn't sleep. As the sun rose, Nora gently tended to Wyatt's burns while he stared into the smoking ruins of his family's history. "This was Louisa," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "She knew I'd be at the Grange Hall. She knew the ranch would be empty." "It's not just Louisa," Nora said quietly. "She's just a pawn. This was Charles Pierce sending a message." "Well, I got the message," Wyatt said, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "He wants to burn everything I have to the ground. He wants to erase me." He stood up, wincing as the movement pulled at his burned skin. But he's not going to get the chance. A rider appeared on the ridge, galloping toward them. It was Sheriff McCall. He took in the scene, the destroyed barn, Wyatt's injuries, Nora's grim face, and his own expression hardened. "I paid a visit to Louisa Romero this morning," the sheriff said, dismounting. "She and her family were gone. Packed up in the middle of the night. Neighbors said a fancy carriage from town came for them." "So she's gone," Nora said, her heart sinking. Their key witness had vanished. "Not exactly," McCall said, a grim smile touching his lips. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "She was in such a hurry she left this behind. Looks like a little ledger of her own. Dates, names, payment amounts. All from Charles Pierce." Wyatt and Nora stared at the book. It was the proof they needed. The smoking gun. "It's enough to get a warrant," McCall said. "But it's not enough to bring him down for good. Pierce will claim she was a disgruntled employee, that he was paying her for ranch supplies. His lawyers will tie this up in court for years. We need something more. We need to find the person who's been sending you those anonymous notes. That's the person Pierce is really afraid of." They spent the day sifting through the evidence, through the names in Louisa's ledger, trying to find a connection, a weak link. The notes had been written on cheap paper, the kind you could buy at any general store. The handwriting was disguised. There was no clue to the sender's identity. As dusk fell, Nora was standing on the porch looking out at the valley when a thought struck her. The paper. The first note had been crumpled, as if carried for a long time. The second had been clean, left on the door. The handwriting was the same, but the condition of the paper was different. Why? She walked back to the kitchen table and looked at the two notes side by side. Then she saw it. A faint watermark on the corner of the second note, the one that had said, "Don't trust her." It was the insignia of the finest hotel in Helena. "Wyatt," she said, her voice trembling with excitement, "I think I know who it is." He came and stood beside her. "Who?" "Someone who has access to expensive hotel stationery," she said. "Someone who would know about Louisa but wouldn't be seen with her in town. Someone who travels between Hamilton and the capital." She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Constance." Wyatt froze. The name of his former fiancée, the governor's daughter, hung in the air between them. Constance is married to a senator. She has no reason to help me." "Doesn't she?" Nora pressed. "Louisa said she ran off with a politician. What if she didn't run off? What if she was forced out? What if Charles Pierce, wanting your land and seeing your engagement to the governor's daughter as a threat, orchestrated the whole thing? What if he ruined her reputation to get her out of the way?" It was a wild theory, a desperate guess. But it was the only one that made sense. A woman scorned, a reputation destroyed, a secret desire for revenge. "There's one way to find out," Wyatt said, his voice tight. "We ride for Helena, tonight." The world had turned on a dime. The ashes of the barn were still warm, but they were no longer on the defensive. They were on the hunt. They were going after the queen in this twisted chess game, and they were about to find out if she was a friend, an enemy, or something else entirely. The final act was about to begin, and it wouldn't end in the valley. It would end in the heart of the state's power, where the biggest lies were told and the darkest secrets were kept.